The cafe buzzed with the chatter of customers, the soft hum of a coffee machine in the background, and the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Jordan, a 16-year-old black teen, walked in with a hopeful smile. He was dressed in a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, just like any other teenager. Today, after weeks of working odd jobs to save up for college, he had decided to treat himself to a caramel latte at the cafe he'd always heard about. It wasn't much, but it was a small reward for all the hard work he'd put in over the past few months. As he stepped inside, the sound of clinking coffee cups and soft conversations created an atmosphere of comfort. He scanned the room, his eyes catching the warm, inviting glow of the cafe. The place looked just like the pictures he'd seen online, and Jordan couldn't help but smile a little as he stood in line at the counter. When it was finally his turn, he walked up to the barista. He smiled politely and said, "Hi, can I get a caramel latte, please?" The barista, a young woman in her mid-20s, barely looked up from her station. Her eyes scanned him for a second before her lips curled into an expression that wasn't quite a smile. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gave him a quick once-over, and her gaze lingered for a beat too long. Jordan's smile faltered, but he didn't say anything. Maybe she was just busy, he thought. Or maybe it was nothing. But then she spoke, her tone colder than he had expected. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice flat, almost dismissive. Jordan, a little taken aback, nodded and repeated, "Yes, just the caramel latte, please." She didn't respond, just turned her back to him, and started preparing the drink, her movements brisk and mechanical. Jordan stood there, slightly confused. He'd been to coffee shops before, and usually the baristas would greet him warmly, especially since he had made an effort to be polite. But here, in this cafe, he felt the unease building inside him. It wasn't just the coldness in the woman's tone. It was the way she had sized him up the moment he walked in. He had seen that look before, the one that didn't see him for who he was, but only as someone who didn't belong. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, the silence between them growing more awkward by the second. He had a sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't about his order. It was about him, his appearance, the way he was dressed, the fact that he was a black teen in a place where people like him weren't often seen. He had been judged before, but something about this moment felt different. The whole cafe seemed oblivious to him, and he felt like an outsider in a place that was supposed to be welcoming. As the barista finished preparing the latte, she slid it across the counter to him without a word, her eyes avoiding his. Jordan hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the cup. He could feel the heat radiating off the drink, but his mind was elsewhere. He didn't want to make a scene, but he didn't want to just walk away either. He had worked so hard to get here, to be in this moment, and yet here he was, treated as though he didn't belong. Jordan stood frozen in the doorway of the small cafe, staring at the barista who had just spoken the words he never expected to hear. He had just walked in to get a simple cup of coffee, a routine, something he had done 100 times before. But this time was different. The woman, who appeared to be in her late 30s, crossed her arms, her eyes scanning him from head to toe with an unsettling look of judgment. Jordan's stomach churned, the words she uttered hanging in the air like a weight. "Are you lost? We don't serve your kind here." Jordan blinked, his mind racing to process what she had just said. His first instinct was to laugh it off, to chalk it up to a misunderstanding. But the tone in her voice was far too harsh to ignore. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice trembling slightly with disbelief. The silence that followed felt thick and heavy. Some of the customers at the nearby table shifted in their seats, glancing over uncomfortably, but none of them spoke up. It was as though they were waiting to see how he would react. "You heard me," the barista sneered. "People like you don't belong here." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the blood rushing to his face, but he stayed rooted to the spot. He had heard the stories, seen the videos, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, being treated like he was less than human, for no reason other than the color of his skin. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had come in, like anyone else, for a cup of coffee. And yet here he was, being belittled and humiliated in front of everyone. It didn't make sense. Trying to stay calm, he asked, "Is there a problem? I just want to order." The barista scoffed, shaking her head in mock disbelief as she grabbed a coffee cup and waved it in his face. "Oh, you want a latte," she mocked. "How about you get out instead?" The words hit harder than anything he had ever experienced. The quiet murmur of the cafe had stopped entirely. He could feel all the eyes on him, judging, watching, waiting. Some customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact, pretending they didn't hear the cruel exchange. Jordan could feel his hands starting to shake, a mix of anger and hurt threatening to bubble over. How could this be happening? He had worked so hard, come so far, and yet this woman, a stranger, had decided in a matter of seconds that he didn't belong, that he wasn't worth the same basic respect that anyone else deserved. But what struck him the most was the realization that, even in the face of blatant racism, no one was willing to speak up. The silence was deafening. Jordan's breath caught in his chest. He had a choice to make. He could walk out, avoid the confrontation, and let it slide. Or he could stand his ground. He had already fought so many battles just to be seen and heard in the world, but it felt like every time he took a step forward, someone like her tried to pull him back. He opened his mouth, ready to say something, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he convince her or anyone else in this place that he was just as human as anyone else? How could he make them understand that he didn't deserve this treatment? But before he could answer, the barista turned away and slammed a cup onto the counter with a finality that felt like a slap. "What's it going to be?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Jordan took a slow, deliberate breath. This was it. He had two options. He could walk away and let this win, or he could fight. He could make them see who he was. Jordan clenched his fists, his breath shallow. He had been through this before, always treated like a criminal before he even spoke, judged based on nothing more than his skin color. But today, something in him snapped. He wasn't going to walk away this time. He had money. He had every right to be in this coffee shop. So why should he have to leave? "I just want my coffee," he said, his voice firm, but there was a hint of frustration creeping through. "You don't have the right to treat me like this." The barista, with her bleach blonde hair and tight-fitting uniform, let out an exaggerated laugh, rolling her eyes as if to belittle him further. "Oh, now you're going to tell me what to do?" she sneered. Jordan stood his ground, trying to keep his voice steady, but inside his heart was racing. He couldn't let her intimidate him. Not today. Not anymore. He had been pushed around far too many times, and the truth was, he was sick of it. The barista leaned in closer, lowering her voice in a deliberate attempt to make him feel even smaller. "I bet you're here to steal something," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I should call the cops." Jordan's stomach sank. He knew exactly where this was headed. A black teen in a store, falsely accused, and now she was going to call the police. He'd seen it happen before, far too many times. An assumption, a quick judgment, a call that could lead to something far more dangerous. His hands began to shake, the anger and fear swelling inside him. But there was no way he was going to give her the satisfaction of backing down. His chest rose and fell with slow, controlled breaths. He wasn't going to be another victim of someone's prejudices. He stood up straighter, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the storm swirling inside him. "Go ahead," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, daring her to follow through. "Call them." The barista looked at him for a moment, a flash of surprise in her eyes, as if she hadn't expected him to stand up for himself. She hesitated, and for a split second the power dynamic shifted. But then, with a smirk, she reached for her phone. Jordan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his cool, maintaining eye contact with her. He wasn't going to be intimidated. Not now, not ever again. But just as she pressed the first few digits on her phone, the door to the cafe opened. Jordan didn't know who walked in, but it didn't matter. The moment she turned her attention to the new customer, he seized it. It was a brief moment of distraction, but it gave him enough time to back away from the counter. The door swung open again, and a man in a suit stepped in, the sound of his voice cutting through the tension. Jordan caught a glimpse of the man's face before he continued past, but it was enough to break the moment. The barista paused mid-sentence, staring at the man, and then looked back at Jordan, her face registering what had just happened. The sudden shift in focus allowed Jordan to slip into the corner of the cafe, still rattled but determined. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew this time was different. He wasn't just a black teen in a store. He was a person with rights, someone who wouldn't be silenced, even in the face of accusations. The barista still stared at him, her hand hovering over the phone, unsure whether to continue or back off. For a brief moment, Jordan felt a flicker of power, of something that he had never been allowed to have before. Control over his own narrative. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, but when the barista finally lowered her phone, it was clear. He had won. For now, at least. But this moment wasn't just about today. It was about taking back what had been taken from him time and time again. And no matter how many people tried to pull him back into the shadows, he was done being invisible, done being treated as less. He had just proven that, even when the world tried to write his story for him, he could still take control of the pen. The barista hesitated again, her eyes darting between Jordan and the rest of the cafe. He could feel her judgment, but now it didn't matter. He had stood his ground. And that small victory, however brief, meant everything. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Drop a comment below. The cafe was bustling with its usual midday crowd, the hum of conversation and clinking cups filling the air. Jordan sat at the counter, his hands nervously gripping the edge of his seat, waiting for his coffee. He had been coming here for weeks, always polite, always waiting for his turn. Today, however, something felt different. A well-dressed older man walked into the cafe, carrying a leather briefcase. He was in his 50s, tall, and exuded an air of confidence. His tailored suit stood out in the sea of casual customers. The man's sharp eyes scanned the room before locking onto Jordan, who was sitting uncomfortably at the counter. His gaze shifted, and Jordan followed his eyes. The barista, who had been waiting impatiently behind the counter, suddenly noticed the man, and her face brightened. She greeted him with a nervous smile. "Oh, Mr. Carter, don't worry. I was just handling a situation," she said, gesturing toward Jordan with a slight smirk on her face. "What's going on here?" Mr. Carter asked, his voice calm but firm as he looked between the barista and Jordan. The barista seemed to pause for a moment, then hesitated before speaking. "This kid was causing trouble. I was about to call the cops." Mr. Carter frowned, a sense of disbelief creeping into his expression. He looked from the barista to Jordan, still sitting quietly at the counter. "Causing trouble? Or ordering coffee?" he asked, his tone level, but the question hit with a quiet force. The barista faltered, her confident attitude suddenly waning. "Well, I mean, he doesn't exactly look like—" She trailed off, trying to find an excuse. Mr. Carter held up a hand, silencing her. "Enough." He turned back to Jordan, his gaze softer now but still commanding. "Young man, what's your name?" Jordan swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. "Jordan, sir," he answered, standing a little taller despite the tension in the room. Mr. Carter nodded as if weighing the situation. He then turned back to the barista, his tone shifting, hardening. "Do you know who I am?" The barista blinked, confused, unsure of where this was going. "Of course. You're the cafe owner," she replied, her voice faltering slightly. Mr. Carter's voice grew sharper. "Then you should know I don't tolerate discrimination in my business." The barista's self-assured smirk quickly faded, replaced by wide eyes of realization. I was just following policy," she stammered, trying to justify her actions. Mr. Carter cut her off before she could finish. "Your policy just got you fired. Get out." Gasps rippled through the cafe. The barista's face drained of color as she realized the gravity of the situation. She opened her mouth to protest, but thought better of it, walking slowly toward the door, her head hung low in shame. Jordan sat frozen, his mind racing. This was all happening so fast. The cafe, which had just moments ago been a place where he felt invisible, was now filled with tension. People were staring, whispering. He had never expected this. Do you think the barista got what she deserved? Let us know your thoughts. Jordan stood still, trying to process the unexpected turn of events. Mr. Carter, the owner of the cafe, was not only defending him, but offering him a kindness that felt completely out of the ordinary. He had been the subject of cruel treatment for so long, and now, for the first time, someone had actually stood up for him. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted as Mr. Carter's words settled into the air. The customers who had been silent, only whispering and murmuring earlier, were now starting to clap. The sound, though soft at first, began to grow louder. Some were nodding in approval, others exchanging looks of agreement. A voice from the back of the room spoke out. About time someone put her in her place. Jordan glanced around. The tension that had filled the room just moments before had dissipated. He could feel his heart begin to slow, the nervousness fading as he processed the justice being served. He hadn't expected any of this, a simple act of kindness, turning into a public display of fairness, the kind of support he never thought he would find in a place like this. Mr. Carter, his expression no longer one of authority but understanding, gestured toward the counter. "Please, order whatever you like. It's on the house." Jordan stood frozen for a moment, uncertain of how to respond. Was this real? Could it be? After the treatment he had endured that morning, the shock of this gesture was almost too much to handle. The idea of actually receiving kindness, of having someone recognize his humanity, was something he had long ago stopped believing was possible. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping up to the counter. His order came out in a quiet voice, still unsure whether he was truly worthy of this generosity. The barista behind the counter, a young woman, smiled warmly at him as she prepared his coffee. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jordan felt as though he belonged. He took the coffee and sat at a table near the window, the sunlight pouring in, casting a soft glow across the room. The café, which had once seemed a place where he was invisible, now felt like a space where he was valued. He took a sip of the warm drink, the bitterness of the coffee mixed with the sweetness of the moment, and for the first time that day, he smiled. As Jordan sat there, the applause continued, slowly fading into whispers of admiration. The injustice of the moment had been replaced with the promise of respect and fairness. Jordan no longer felt like an outsider. He felt human again, seen and heard. And for the first time, he wasn't just the person people ignored. He was someone deserving of kindness. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't reach for it. He didn't need anything else to validate his place in the world today. He had already received something far more valuable: dignity. And that, for now, was enough. "Thank you," he whispered under his breath as he looked toward Mr. Carter, who was now speaking with the barista, but occasionally glancing toward Jordan with a look of quiet approval. No words were necessary between them. He finally felt like he belonged. Have you ever witnessed an act of justice like this? Let's talk. The café was quiet, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air as Jordan sipped his cup. Mr. Carter sat across from him, his weathered hands resting on the table, his voice steady and calm. "You remind me of myself when I was young," Mr. Carter said, leaning back in his chair. "People doubted me too." Jordan looked up, intrigued. The elderly man had always been a source of wisdom, someone who had seen more than his fair share of challenges. "What do you mean?" Jordan asked, his curiosity piqued. Mr. Carter smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the weight of the past. "You see, when I was growing up, I was just like you. People would look at me, judge me, assume I wasn't good enough. But I didn't let that stop me. I kept pushing, even when I was the only one who believed in me." Jordan nodded, taking in the man's words. He had always faced the challenges of being an outsider, of being judged by people who didn't take the time to get to know him. His whole life had been shaped by the bias of others, but something inside him had always told him he was worth more than the labels society placed on him. Mr. Carter leaned forward, his tone becoming more serious. "Don't ever let people like that stop you," he continued, his voice full of conviction. "You deserve respect no matter where you go. No one has the right to make you feel small." The weight of those words settled deep in Jordan's heart. He had spent his whole life battling people's assumptions, fighting for recognition and equality. He had faced prejudice, injustice, and racism. But Mr. Carter's words were a reminder that his worth wasn't defined by those who doubted him. It was defined by who he was and what he stood for. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift off his shoulders. Jordan felt a new sense of clarity, a strength he had been looking for all his life. He realized that no matter what happened, there would always be people who saw him for who he truly was, people who respected him, who appreciated his worth. And those were the people who mattered. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Jordan found himself lost in thought. The conversation had opened a new door in his mind, one that had been closed for far too long. His doubts, his fears, they all seemed insignificant now in the face of Mr. Carter's wisdom. When it was time to leave, Jordan stood up from the table, feeling a shift within himself. He was no longer the same person who had walked into the cafe earlier that morning. The world felt different, more hopeful. And as he walked out of the cafe, the sun felt a little brighter, his steps a little lighter. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that today justice had won in his heart. He didn't need anyone's approval or validation to know his worth. He had learned to believe in himself as he walked down the street. A final question lingered in his mind. What would you have done in Jordan's place? Would you have stayed, or would you have walked away? Jordan didn't need to answer that question. He knew now that the only thing that truly mattered was standing up for yourself, no matter who was watching, no matter what people thought. This was his time, and he was ready to take it